Thanks, Julie. All right, well, thank you. My name is Eddie. I work here at NC State, funny enough. So if you are part of the College of Engineering, I work in the IT department with the College of Engineering. So over on Centennial campus, go Engineers. Let me just quickly introduce myself. Thank you, Nick. So me and my wife, Erica, right down there, we have two kids, Millie and Oliver, 8 and 6. We came up to the Wake Forest, Raleigh area about 12 years ago. I graduated from LSU, go Tigers, sorry guys. But we are Wolfpack fans now, I will give you guys that. But I graduated with my electrical engineering degree and came up here to Southeastern. If you don't know about Southeastern, it's a little Baptist seminary in Wake Forest, just to the north, about 30 to 40 minutes away. There, I got my master's degree in Christian apologetics. I realized that I love apologetics. There was just something about finding confidence in the faith that you believe in, and to think that there are actually good reasons to believe in this thing that we call Christianity. Why would we believe in such a thing? Why go to church? Why give your life to Christ? For me, apologetics is what sort of solidified that for me. I am also getting my PhD at Southeastern as well in apologetics and culture. I'm writing, funny enough, if you want to talk to me about this later, I am writing my dissertation on video games, of all things. That's a whole nother topic, not tonight's topic or next week's topic, but we can talk about that as well. But why problem of evil? For me, this is by far my favorite topic. I love the problem of evil. Not because I love evil. I always have to clarify that, right? I don't actually love evil things, but I love this topic. It was the topic in apologetics that sort of grabbed my interest. I took a class at Southeastern called The Problem of Evil, and we spent a whole semester talking about this. So we could go for hours. I will not. We only have like less than an hour to go through some introductory stuff. And then the next week, we're going to go through in a lot more detail, and I'll kind of share a little bit about sort of the position that I hold next week as well. All right, so if you're not going anywhere for Thanksgiving, come hang out with us. I'll talk to you and we'll give you guys a full rundown of how the problem of evil breaks down. But why do I love this topic so much? Why the problem of evil? Because I think, in my opinion, it is the single most important topic that Christians have to face. You look at the news, we think about what just happened in Western North Carolina, we think about things in history like the Holocaust, Stalin, whatever, name your pick. There is evil. And Christians, we have to figure out, how does God fit into this picture? Because we can't deny the existence of evil, but yet evil seems to be a pretty strong detractor for God's existence. And so as I studied the problem of evil, one of the things I realized is that this topic hits on everything about your faith. You're going to touch on subjects like creation, God's relationship to creation, God's relationship to you, salvation, end times, name your pick. I love the problem of evil, not because of evil, but because this one subject really forced me to refine my faith. It taught me, how do I think about who God is and his relationship to the world? All right? So a couple other things. We are talking tonight about the intellectual, not the emotional side. So I will talk about this in just a minute, but there are two sides to the problem of evil. Oh, get past this. And then I also want you guys to be aware that this topic is sensitive for some people. For some of you, maybe this is a very sensitive topic. Maybe you've lost loved ones. You've lost someone to cancer, to disease. Maybe you've experienced evil and suffering in your own life. When we talk about the problem of evil, although I will use analogies and there will be some kind of lightheartedness to it, for some, we have to realize, especially if we call ourselves Christians, that those that we talk to about this topic, they may have a very soft spot for this. This may be a really tender subject. So we take care. We don't talk about this only in the intellectual side, but also so that we can minister to those who need ministering. So I encourage you, come to this topic with an open mind. You may already have some thoughts on the problem of evil. I bet you do. I bet you already have a response in your head of how you would respond to the topic. I may not agree with you, and that's totally fine. We can disagree on this topic and still be friends, right? I don't want this to cause any sort of wedge or any sort of issue between us. What I'm going to ask you to do is to really consider how you, and especially if you call yourself a Christian, how do you understand who God is in the light of this? At the end of the day, you have to have your own response to the problem of evil. It has to be yours, and it has to be something that works for you personally. All right? All right, so there are two views on the problem of evil. There's the emotional side of things. This is something like Psalm 13, where the psalmist cries out, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" Or Job, when he says, "Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you?" The emotional side cries out. It's the hurt that we feel, right? This is the someone hurt me, or I'm suffering, and life is just hard. I don't know you all personally, obviously, but I bet you all have suffered in some way. Life has not been perfect for you. The problem of evil cries out internally. Why, God? Why allow all this hurt in my life? I thought you were good. I thought you were all loving. I thought you loved me. Why am I hurting so much? That's the emotional side. I'm not a trained counselor. I am technically a philosopher by trade. So I'm not well suited to deal with emotional things. In fact, I would say if you do struggle with the emotional side, this is a great place to find a counselor, therapist, or even a pastor to talk to. They can help you with a lot of the emotional side of things here. What we're going to be talking about is the intellectual. What I mean is, does the problem of evil discount or disprove the Christian faith? In other words, when we look out into the world and we see all the evils in the world, all the suffering, and all the unequal suffering, does that mean God does not exist? Right? That's the conclusion that the problem of evil gets us to. Maybe we can just appeal to mystery. You guys ever done that before? Well, we simply don't know. Why do we have to figure this out? We do this for lots of other things. Maybe things like, how does salvation work? Or what happens to unreached people groups? What do we do about that? We often appeal to mystery. I don't think we can appeal to mystery. I'm going to give you guys a couple reasons why. And I'm going to give you guys some reasons why we, especially as Christians, have to address this question. I think for you, you need to have an answer, at least for yourself, and then for others. So first, I think as Christians, we hold that the Christian worldview, this idea of the Christian religion, Christianity, is the best worldview. And I'm not trying to say that pridefully. I say that truthfully. I truly believe that the Christian faith provides the best view of how things are in this world. If that's the case, I need to have an answer for humanity's most pressing and persistent question. Why is there evil? Why? Why does bad things keep happening? Why? Number two, I think the world expects an answer from you, especially if you're a Christian, on this topic. You claim that God is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-good, but yet evil still exists. The world looks at you and goes, how can those two things work together? You need to have an answer. This is an issue faced by everyone. Hopefully you kind of pointed out, you've suffered. Maybe other people you know have suffered. Christians and non-Christians, we all suffer. So we all need to have an answer. And then this is probably something you're going to have to deal with yourself. I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer tonight, but I hate to say it, at some point, you will encounter suffering. You will encounter evil. You may lose a loved one. I will tell you, the older you get, the more people pass away. It's really hard, right? This is something that you're going to have to confront. I'm also going to tell you that I think the problem of evil is also the one topic that trips up the most people coming to faith. It's the biggest barrier, I think. I'm going to give you guys two stories to reflect on. The first is, you guys know about Bart Ehrman over at UNC, right, professor of New Testament and Greek studies. He is an atheist. He believes that God doesn't exist and the Bible is just simply not true. If you didn't know his history, though, Bart Ehrman was not always an atheist. He actually was a Christian growing up, and he went actually to seminary, studied the Bible, was looking to become a Bible scholar. At some point in his life, he switched, and he became an atheist. He would say that it was because of his study of the Bible, that there are inconsistencies and there are issues and discrepancies in the Bible. However, others believe that Bart Ehrman's deconversion, if you want to call it that, back to atheism, they believe it wasn't actually due to any sort of Bible inconsistency, but due to some evil that he faced. Whether that was the passing of a close family member or something along those lines. They actually believe he suffered something so personal that he could not get over it intellectually. Second story I'll share is I used to work at Best Buy. So I used to be in the Geek Squad, so I had the little outfit, little tie and everything. I used to drive around. I actually didn't drive around, but I fixed a lot of computers in the process. While I worked at Best Buy, I had a coworker named Husheng. He was Indian, and he was a wonderful guy, and he's atheist. And as a seminary student, me and him, we went back and forth all the time. Especially as an apologetics guy, we went back and forth constantly. Why do you think God exists? Well, this is why I think God exists. No, of course not. And we just go back and forth, back and forth. He told me that the biggest thing that stopped him from becoming a Christian was the problem of evil. We went through every argument imaginable. But at the end of the day, he said, I simply cannot believe in God, that he would allow so much evil in this world. How could that God exist? And you still claim that he's good and powerful. I think the problem of evil is the toughest thing we have to deal with. It is the thing that's probably going to give you the most doubt in your Christian faith. It is the thing that hits you the most personal. And at the end of the day, it is the thing that you have to have an answer for yourself. Whatever answer you give, it will need to be both theologically sound and biblically correct. And you have to determine what that is. Your view may be different from my view. That's okay. All right, let's talk about God's attributes. Wait a second. Why are we talking about God's attributes? This isn't a theology class. What's going on here? The problem of evil is not really about evil. Gotcha. The problem of evil is actually about who we say God is. The problem of evil claims that God cannot be all good and all powerful and all knowing, and yet there continues to be so much evil in the world. At the end of the day, we're not arguing about whether evil exists or not. We all agree to that. What we're arguing about is who God says he is, and who do you say God is. So at the end of the day, you have to have a really good, robust theology for yourself. So I have a couple words for you guys. There are three big O words that are often used to describe God. The first one is omnipotent. Can y'all say that with me? Omnipotent. Omnipotent, good. How would you define omnipotent? Someone, real quick.
All-powerful.
All-powerful. All right, what does that mean? What does it mean that God is all-powerful?
He can do anything.
He can do anything. All right. Let me ask you this classic brain teaser then. Can God create a rock so heavy that even he could not lift?
He can do anything that's logically coherent.
That's right. Very good, Julian. So when we talk about God's omnipotence, we often say God can do all things that are logically possible. So we would say God could not create a rock that is so heavy, even he could not lift, because that is illogical. It doesn't make sense. Or could God create a world where 2 + 2 = 5? We'd say probably not, because mathematically and logically, that does not work. So God is able to do all things that are logically possible. That's a key distinction there. Second word is omniscient. Omniscient. All right, so not omniscience, those of you science majors in the room, it's omniscient. This means that God has all past, present, and then future knowledge. So this means God knows what's happened before. So way back in, say, the Roman Empire, he knows what's currently happening now, that you guys are in this room and you're sitting here, hopefully listening. If not, that's okay too. And he knows what's going to happen in the future. Maybe you're going to go and get some food because we're out of pizza now, right? So God knows all of these things, and he knows them all at once. All right, what's the last one? Anyone know what the last one is?
Omnipresent.
Oh, that's a good one. Actually, not the last one, though. Jackson?
Omnibenevolent.
Very good. Omnibenevolence. So omnipresence is one. That would say God is in all places at all times. The last one we're going to talk about that kind of affects our conversation is God's omnibenevolence. This means that God is all good and all loving. This is non-negotiable. Actually, let me be fair. None of these are negotiable for the Christian. If you say that you believe in the Christian God, you hold that God has all three attributes, and he is these things. He is all-powerful within logic, he is omniscient, and he is omnibenevolent. He's all-loving and all-good.
Would omnibenevolence mean like he's perfect as well?
Yeah, we can put holiness could be another way of putting that. They do tend to separate those, but you can combine them if you wish. Basically, there is nothing evil or bad that comes from God. He is all good. And so because of that, we can't ever say God creates or authors evil. How could something evil come from something so good? God's also all loving. This means that he loves you. And he loves you a lot. But what does that love mean? This is how we're going to flesh this out. All right? And so again here, if God's missing any of these attributes, you've lost the Christian God. You have to keep these. And this is what the problem of evil is going to push back against. Is God truly all three things? All right, types of evils, because not all evils are just the same, I guess. Maybe that's not the right word to use. Anyways, natural evils. So these are evils that are caused by forces of nature. Think hurricanes, tornadoes. Again, hurricane that came through Western North Carolina, Hurricane Helene. That is a great example of natural evil. My wife and I are both from Louisiana, so we've seen our fair share of hurricanes like Katrina and Ivan, Gustav, name your pick. A lot of death, a lot of destruction. Physical evils are evils like diseases. So think cancer, COVID, Ebola, whatever, name your pick, right? Now, generally, some people will combine these two together. They'll claim that physical and natural evils are just under one category called natural. I tend to put them separately because I think they kind of work a little bit differently. It's totally fine if you want to combine them together. Not a problem. And then finally, you have moral evils. This is the one that most people think about. This is evils committed from one person or one agent to another. I'm going to pick on my pastor in the room because I use him for all my examples here. Carson over there is our pastor at North Wake. If you want to come to church in Wake Forest for some reason. If I walk up and I see Carson on the street and I stab Carson, that is an example of moral evil. One agent committing evil to another agent, right? So your response and whatever response you come up with to the problem of evil has to cover all three in some way, shape, and form. That's hard, all right? I'm going to tell you the hardest ones are not the ones of me stabbing my pastor in hypothetical worlds. It's usually the things of innocent suffering, particularly things like children. When children have cancer, when children are hurt in some way, God, why? Why would you allow them to go through such suffering? Your response to whatever evil, you have to be able to cover all three things. And you have to be able to provide a good explanation for how God allows those things to happen. It's tough. I can tell you, as a parent, it gets even tougher because you feel it a lot more personally at that point. All right, let's get into the actual argument. We've been talking a while. We haven't even got to the problem yet. What is the problem of evil? Funny enough, there are two problems. I'm going to give you both of them because I want you guys to understand what's going on here. So the first one is what we call the logical problem of evil. This is the one that you've probably heard in some way, shape, and form. In fact, when I say it, you'll probably be pretty familiar with it. It goes like this. If God is all-powerful or omnipotent, he could destroy evil. If God is all-loving or good, omnibenevolent, he would destroy evil. Evil exists. Therefore, God does not exist. This is your standard problem of evil argument that you've probably seen or heard in some way, shape, or form. I can tell you my former coworker at Best Buy, this is the exact argument he put right back at me. If God is all-powerful and he's all-loving, why is there all this evil? Couldn't he stop it, right? Let me use my example here. I'm going to stab my pastor once again. God allows me to stab my pastor. He does not stop me. God is all-powerful. He certainly could. God is all-loving. He certainly loves Carson. But yet he doesn't stop me. He allows it. Why? If God is truly these two attributes here, then he would stop these things. And because he doesn't, the atheist comes back and says, God does not exist. There is an inconsistency between these 3 points here, between who God is, or who we claim God is, and the fact that evil actually exists in the world. You kind of see that tension that's kind of building here, especially if you're a Christian. This is the tension that builds in the problem of evil. Because, yeah, I do agree. God is all-powerful. God is all-loving. But yet evil seems to exist. How? How could we allow such evil to exist? What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to give you guys a couple of quick responses to the problem of evil. Next week, I'm going to give you guys a whole bunch more. We're going to go through a whole bunch of them. I'm going to give you guys just sort of the taste, like an appetizer tonight. If you have questions, we can talk about them, but there is more coming next week, all right? So the first one is what we call the free will defense. This is by a guy named Alvin Plantinga. He is a Christian philosopher. He came up with what he called the free will defense. And he essentially says, God's creation of persons with morally significant free will is something of tremendous value. God could not eliminate much of the evil and suffering in the world without thereby eliminating the greater good of having created persons with free will, with whom he could have relationships with, and who are able to love one another and do good deeds. So Alvin Plantinga, this Christian philosopher, comes back and says, well, God allows evil because he's given all of us free will. That seems to make sense, right? Let me give you an example. You could have chosen not to come here tonight. You have every right to do so, and you could have chosen that and went and did something else probably more productive with your night. But you chose to be here. I could have chose to not stab my pastor and take him to the hospital. But yet God gives me free will, so I made that choice to do so. That free will is so valuable that it's worth the evils that come of it. This includes things like Adam and Eve. They would say they made the first choice in free will, and their choice has doomed the rest of humanity in the process. Let me ask you guys a question now that I'm thinking about it. When does evil enter the world? Those of you with some Bible knowledge, when does evil first enter the world? Show of hands. Adam and Eve is the first time.
I was going to say the fall of man.
Fall of man, yeah. So Adam and Eve. Okay. How many of you guys would agree? Adam and Eve, that is when evil enters the world.
Like the human world. Yeah.
Ah. Human world. Interesting. There's another player on the scene at the fall. Who else is present?
Satan.
Satan. That's right. According to biblical doctrine, we would say Satan fell first at some point. We don't know when. All we know is that between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, at some point, Satan falls. A third of the angels go with him. and then he's able to infiltrate and deceive Adam and Eve. And then the fall of man occurs shortly after. Free will. We have a choice, and we can make a choice. Does the free will defense work? Again, it basically says humans have true free will. You're able to make choices. And because of free will, there are sometimes good or bad consequences. You can use free will for good things, like coming here tonight. That's a good thing. I'm going to give you guys that one. But you can also make it for bad things, doing evil deeds. And again, the whole point is that free will is more valuable than not. So, Plantinga believes that God could not create a world where people have free will but no evil. So that's why God allows evil to occur. All right, seems to make sense. And I will go ahead and kind of spoil it for you. The free will defense is widely agreed upon by scholars to have basically solved the logical problem. Why? Because it presents one possibility where God allows evil and his attributes to not be in conflict with one another. I think we have other problems here with the free will defense. Not particularly with the logical problem, but just in general. Does this really explain natural evils super well? That's a tough one. In other words, does my committing evil thus lead to hurricanes dumping a ton of water in western North Carolina? I don't know. The connections don't really seem to make a lot of sense. You also have questions of things like, if we have free will, how does God know what we're going to do? Is he just sort of guessing that we're going to make the right choice? Is God truly omniscient at this point? How do you deal with things like God's sovereignty? Is God truly in control of all creation? Or is creation just sort of running amok on its own? Theological problems start to come up as well. But I want you to know that the logical problem, by scholars at least, and philosophers, have mostly agreed. Alvin Plantinga's free will defense has solved the logical problem. Now, you may be looking at me and going, I don't agree with that at all. How does this solve anything? Plantinga doesn't actually believe in the free will defense, in that he believes that this is the solution to all problems of evil. All Plantinga is doing is trying to offer one possibility where the inconsistencies now, the illogicalness of the argument is no longer at fault. That's all he does. And in that sense, from a philosophical standpoint, he is largely successful. He's done what he set out to do. But did this actually solve all the problems? Like, you look at this and you may say, I'm not super satisfied with how this argument goes. Is there something more? There is. There's a second argument called the evidential argument from the problem of evil. This is where things get fun. This is where things get kind of tricky in some sense. So the logical problem is mostly solved, but there's a new guy that shows up. His name is William Rowe. He is called the friendly atheist. He was another Christian who converted to atheism. He's called the friendly atheist because he believes that Christianity is not true, but if you're a Christian, sure, you can hold to your faith and not be considered illogical. But he still thinks the Christian faith isn't true. That's why he's called the friendly atheist. He kind of gives you a bone and says, if you want to believe it, it's fine. It's not a big deal. He came up with what is now widely known as the evidential problem from evil. This evidential problem from gratuitous evils, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, is now widely considered to be the most formidable objection to the theistic belief. If you're a Christian, this is the problem you have to deal with. It's not the logical. Most people still rely on the logical. It's the one that's most popular in today's circles. But the evidential problem is actually what's at large. This is what's in debates, if you want to talk about that in the academic circle. What is the evidential argument? It's a little long, but let me give it to you in its full, because I want you guys to be well-read and well-suited. It goes like this. There exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Number 2, an omniscient, wholly good being, God, right, would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. There's a note, there's a caveat to this argument though. This problem is more correctly stated that in light of the unequally distributed suffering, intense suffering, and the suffering of innocence, it is reasonable to conclude that God probably does not exist. If you know anything about logic, the logical argument is what we called a deductive argument. In other words, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. It's a one-to-one. There's no wiggle room between any of them. The evidential argument is different. This is an argument from probability. William Rowe looks at the world and he says, when I look at the world and I look at how much evil there is, it seems more likely that God does not exist than that he does. And not just that there's so much evil, but that it is unequal and it is intense for some people. You can kind of think about this way. Some people seem to suffer a lot more than other people. Some people seem to have okay lives. Some people seem to have some pretty cruddy lives. Why is that fair, God? There are some people who are faithful Christians, and they seem to suffer the most. There are some people who are not Christians, and they seem to have it pretty good. What in the world, God? Why do it this way? Rowe looks at that and he basically says, I can't believe that a God exists. It seems more reasonable to conclude God doesn't exist than that he does. It is an argument from probability. And therefore, this argument is significantly stronger. Because it's not about whether God does or doesn't exist. It's about whether or not he may or may not exist. It's a small subtlety, but it makes all the difference now in this argument. So, Rowe's argument also depends on something called gratuitous evils. Throw a lot of terms at you tonight. Something called gratuitous evils. This is an evil that an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or preventing some evil equally bad or worse. We're going to talk about greater good in just a minute. But essentially, a gratuitous evil is some evil in which nothing else comes out of it. It is what we call pointless, purposeless. It has no meaning. Rowe gives us 2 examples of why he thinks that there are gratuitous evils in the world. The first one is what he calls the case of Bambi. This is what he calls E1. And Bambi is this made-up scenario. He basically says, imagine, if you would, a little deer walking through the forest. Lightning hits a tree, the tree falls on the deer, crushes the deer. The deer, in agonizing pain for 3 days, eventually dies after suffering unimaginably. Okay? Position number 2, or example number 2. This is from a real-life example. It's a little graphic, but you're adults in the room, so I think you can handle it. This comes from a news story back in, I think, the 1980s. It's the case of Sue. There's a 5-year-old girl whose mother's boyfriend rapes and tortures and murders her. And this is a real story. You can find it in, I think, the Chicago Tribune or something like that. Rowe looks at both of these examples. He makes up one with Bambi and says, yeah, this seems super likely. This could definitely happen. And then he takes a story straight from the tabloids. He says, I have 2 examples here of evil. They both are horrific. Where is the good in any of this? Why does God allow Bambi to be crushed by a tree and eventually die? Why does God allow Sue to suffer so unimaginably at age 5 and then also die at the same time. It seems more likely, given the examples that I'm showing you, and he gives you just two, he says, I could pull out hundreds, thousands, millions more. Where is God in all this? It seems more unlikely that God exists because of the evils in the world, and there doesn't seem to be any response from God. So what's the Christian's response? There's a new response out there, or not new, it's pretty old actually. There's a response out there called the greater good theodicy. This is a response that you have heard, you may even hold it. I believe, and I don't really have any hard numbers, I'm just going to make up some numbers here. I think about 90 to 95% of Christians hold to the greater good theodicy. I'm going to explain to you why. You may hold to this. That is totally fine. I'm going to go ahead and reveal some of my cards. I do not hold to the greater good theodicy. This is a theodicy that's been passed down through Christian tradition. If you are a Christian and you need a response to the problem of evil, you're totally fine to hold the greater good theodicy. That is fine. I'm just going to show my cards again. All responses in some way, shape, and form have problems. The greater good is going to have some significant problems you're going to have to deal with. All right? What does the greater good theodicy say? The greater good theodicy says God only allows that evil in this world from which he can bring about a greater good or prevent a worse evil. And if you are a Christian, this has to be proven in every single case. Let me give you an example. I'm going to stab my pastor again. A lot of stabbing. He's getting stabbed a lot. Let's say I stab my pastor, Carson. I see him on the street. I stab him. He goes to the hospital. All right? At the hospital, he meets his wife, and he also gets a lawsuit of, let's say, speak of some number, like $1 million. All right? So pretty good. Life's pretty good for him. That is what we would call a greater good. God allows me to stab Carson so that he may allow a greater good to come out of it. See how that works? There's an evil that's allowed. It's allowed because it's connected to some greater good that God has already planned. All right? So this is in every single case. You have to provide some greater good to every instance of evil. It's the most popular response by Christians. And God allows it because he's planning to bring some greater good. So think about this big picture. God allows the Hurricane Helene to occur because he's bringing about some greater good. God allows the suffering of innocents, children, because there's some greater good that comes out of it. Let's see if I have a good picture. Yep. And it denies gratuitous evil. Because if every evil has some greater good, then there is no such thing as gratuitous evil anymore. So remember, gratuitous evils, these are evils that do not have any purpose. There is no reason or nothing that comes afterwards for those evils. If greater good theodicy is true, then every evil is allowed by God because he already has some plan for that evil. And there's my classic greater good gift that I love from The Incredibles. This is how the greater good theodicy works. In some way, shape, and form, if you hold to a greater good, this is what you believe. Most Christians hold to this. I want to be very clear. If you hold to a greater good theodicy, that is totally fine. There is no problem at all. This is what most historical Christians have held throughout history. Revealing my cards, I do not hold to the greater good. I think there are some significant problems, and I think theologically and philosophically, you run into a lot of issues with who God is. But I will tell you that there is also biblical support for the greater good. So if you hold greater good, you're thinking, oh yeah, of course, why wouldn't I? Because the Bible would seem to say so. Let me give you guys some biblical support for why that's the case. The first one comes from Genesis 50:20. This is the story of Joseph and his brothers. If you remember from your Bible story, Joseph gets sold by his brothers. He's the guy with the fancy coat, like lots of colors. He gets sold into slavery, and he goes to Egypt. But then a famine hits Egypt. At that point, Joseph has risen in the ranks, and he's able to help his brothers who are suffering from this famine that's come through the land. And he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Hey, see the connection there? God allows something to happen, which is that his brothers sell him into slavery, not really a good thing, so that something good would come out of it. Greater good. There's a connection there. The next one is from Job 42:12 through 13. And it says, "And the Lord blessed the later days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters." If you remember the story of Job and the book of Job, at the beginning, he loses everything. He loses his children, his livestock, everything, right?
Yeah.
Everything but his wife.
Everything but his wife. Everything but his wife. But even he's afflicted too. Don't forget that. He's afflicted with sores and all sorts of painful ailments, right? This says Job didn't just get back what he had before, he got back more. You see the greater good connection there? It's not just a good that he gets out of it, he gets a greater good that comes out of it, something even better. And then finally, the most classic verse is Romans 8:28. "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." This is your classic greater good passage. If you're greater good, most people will reference this passage in some way, shape, and form. All right? So let me kind of draw it out because I have a whiteboard here. It's kind of cool. How does the greater good work? Let's say you have evils. Let's say this evil has a value attached to it, because some evils are better than other evils, or more horrific, that's probably the best word to use, than other evils. I'm going to stab my pastor once again. That's probably, I'm going to make up a number here, on the scale of evils, something like a 3. It's an evil of 3. It's bad, but you know what? It only happened to him, so it's really not that bad in the grand scheme of things. What the greater good says is that the greater good that my pastor receives after I stab him has to be of value greater than the evil that occurs to him. So he goes to the hospital, meets his wife, and gets $1 million. That good could have a value of 5. Value-wise, the good is greater than the evil. You see how that works? But this also applies for evils that are significantly worse. I'm going to give you guys a hard one, the Holocaust. We're going to give that a value of 10. All right, I'm just making up numbers here. Don't hold, these are not like real values I'm giving to evil. The Holocaust has a value of 10. In theory, that means that good has to then have a value of at least 11, because it has to be a greater good. That's how that distinction works. Whatever evil is allowed, the following good has to be greater. And you can kind of see that in some of the scripture being referenced here. I don't think the greater good theodicy holds. I think there are some significant problems with it. I'm going to go ahead and tell you a couple with the Bible verses to get you started. Next week, we will dive in a lot deeper, and then next week I'll give you my version or my response. What do I believe is a better response than a greater good theodicy? You don't have to believe me. You don't. Like, legitimately, I believe what I believe because it's my own review, or not the one I came up with, but the one that I hold to myself. You have to pick a view that works for you. At the end of the day, that is all that matters. It doesn't matter what I think about it. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about it. It matters if it works for you. I think these 3 verses don't give you greater good. I think if you look at Genesis with the story of Joseph, I think that is a one-off. One good thing happens to Joseph. It does not mean that there are greater goods that can be applied in every situation. We would call that an example of a descriptive thing that happens in Scripture, not a prescriptive, meaning the Bible is just telling you what happens. It's not telling you what is actually the case in reality. Job does seem to get more. He gets a lot more animals. He gets more children. Okay, maybe you can make an argument there. As my wife would say, replacing my dead children with more children isn't really fixing the problem, right? You're not actually adding to my blessings. I still mourn for the children who died in the first place. Doesn't really work. In Romans 8:28, who is that specifically for? What does it say there? For those who love God. Romans 8:28 seems to be specifically for the Christian. As a Christian, I do think we have some greater goods we can look forward to. As a Christian, I believe that when I die, I will go to heaven. And that is the greatest good I will ever get, for sure, bar none. But what about for the non-Christian? What about for when they go through significant suffering? What do they have to look forward to? Because their suffering is also unequal. I can easily give you examples of non-Christians, some who suffer a lot and some who suffer very little. How is that fair in any way? Where's the greater good that even comes from that? I think Romans 8:28 is a promise for the Christian that there is a future hope that we look forward to, but it doesn't make life easy now. It doesn't really explain the unequal suffering that some of us face. I think you can think about maybe in your own lives, some folks that are suffering from maybe things like cancer. Why is that fair, God? Or you think about some other folks who seem to have it pretty easy. They have life pretty good. Maybe they suffer a little bit. Why do they get to have a better life than these other people? Why is the suffering unequal? That's what Rowe is getting at. Rowe basically says it's unequal, and even if you get good things as a Christian, that doesn't mean good comes from every instance of evil. Remember, the greater good says every single instance of evil must have a corresponding greater good. If it doesn't, now you have gratuitous evil. And even one instance of gratuitous evil counts against God. Because why would God allow something to happen if he's not bringing something good out of it? Particularly a greater good. That's what the greater good theodicy says. So if you hold a greater good theodicy, you believe every evil has some greater good that comes from it at some point. At the end of the day, every view has its problems. Every view has its problems. For free will, you have problems of God's sovereignty, God's omniscience. Can God truly know all things if he doesn't even know what you're going to do? Can you surprise God? Haha, gotcha, God. Or with the greater good, how can we show that there's good in every instance of evil? Think about some of the most horrific evils. Think about the case of Sue and that Roe just gave. Remember that E2 we talked about? He looks at Sue and he says, where is the greater good? Show me. Show me where the greater good is for this 5-year-old that is raped and then murdered by her mother's boyfriend. Show me. Because Roe says, if you can't show me where the greater good is, then where is God in all of this to begin with? So you have a problem of showing, but then also in the greater good, all things are already what we call preordained by God. And that would seem to make sense on this view. If God has already planned for evils to be allowed, because he's already planned a greater good out of it, do I really have the freedom to do whatever I want? I'm going to stab my pastor. But wait, am I actually allowed to stab my pastor? Or am I going to do that anyways because there's a greater good that's already been planned from the start? Greater goods would say God has already preordained all things because he's already planned out what evils are allowed and what greater goods flow from those evils. They have to be connected, right? God doesn't just say, oh, there's an evil, let me go and make some good. No, he says, I allowed this evil to occur because there is some greater good I already have planned coming from this evil. There's a direct connection between the two. But how can you always make that connection? I'm going to stab my pastor. I'm going to stab him a lot of times. So many times. I stab him, and let's say that in the hospital, he has another stroke. This is a really traumatic time for him. He gets stabbed, he has a stroke in the hospital, but at the end of it, he meets his wife, and he becomes saved. He's not a pastor at this point, but he becomes saved, and he is now a Christian. Which greater good, or which evil is that greater good attached to? Is it attached to me stabbing him? Or is it attached to the stroke that he had? Can you make a difference? Can you make a distinction between which one is which? If you can't, what's happening here? Which evil is allowed so that a greater good, meeting his wife, finding salvation, is then the end result? We have a connection problem too sometimes with greater good. Sometimes it's really hard to make the connection between what has happened and what is yet to come. That's a problem. All right, I'm going to end today because I want to give you guys some time to ask questions. If that's okay, Julian. I don't know what. Yep. So I'm going to give you guys some resources to look at. So from left to right, you have Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God. Tim Keller gives a really quick introduction to the problem of evil here. It's like 15, 20 pages. It's quick and easy. I think he does a great job from a pastoral standpoint, but he maybe suffers a little bit from the intellectual. There's another book that you can't find anymore, but if you can somehow find it on Amazon, you should buy it. It is God and Evil by Michael Peterson. It is the best introduction to the problem of evil that I've seen so far. It talks about everything that we've talked about tonight, and I just can't find it in print anymore. So if you can somehow find it, great, because it is a wonderful book to get. The second from the right, in the middle, is God and the Problem of Evil. That's 5 views. This is written by one of my former professors. So they basically give you 5 different views on the problem of evil. And then the one on the very end there is God and Evil. This is also a highly recommended book. It's very accessible. It's very easy to read. And it's going to give you a great introduction and a little bit more depth into a lot of the topic here. All right, last 3 books here. Is The Problem of Evil, another introduction by Jeremy Evans. That's the one on the very left. And if you want these books later, I can send them to you. You don't have to take pictures of all these. I can send them to you and the Amazon link if you want. And then the Alvin Plantinga book is the one in the middle. That's the free will defense that we just talked about from Alvin Plantinga. If you want a really short introduction to the logical problem of evil, that's a fantastic book. It's like 120 pages. It's a super easy read, and Alvin Plantinga is just to the point. He gets really deep into philosophy, but he is to the point. And then finally, hey look, the evidential argument from evil. There it is. That's a pretty tough read, but if you want to get into the weeds, we can get into the weeds with some of that. All right? So what I wanted to do tonight was to give you guys just an introduction to the topic. What is the problem of evil? What is going on here? Why are we even talking about this problem, this evil in our world? I'm giving you a super brief overview of the problem. Next week, we're going to nerd out on the problem. All right? We're going to look at all the different views that have been offered, including the 2 that we went over tonight. There's like 5 or 6 more we're going to talk about next week. And then at the very end, I will give you my view. You don't have to accept it. I'm just going to give you what I believe is a better alternative, in my opinion. You don't have to agree with me. I just want to give you guys options to choose from for what you believe. All right? So I want to give this time to you, though. Do you have questions for me? Yes, sir.
How do you know what is considered a greater good? Is that not an objective statement?
Yeah, no, so the question is, how do you know what is a greater good? Yeah, I don't know. Right? I think that's a really tough question to ask is, what is actually a greater good here? Is, my pastor finding his wife in the hospital, is that truly a greater good? Don't know. It's hard to say, right? And that's where I think the value system kind of comes into play, because we try to now assign value to goods and evils. Like me stabbing my pastor versus a hurricane hitting North Carolina. Is one really worse than the other? Is it just the amount of people who died? Is it the amount of suffering? Is it the length of suffering? We don't really know. And so I would honestly just say, I don't know, because I don't think we can really put a good number on that. And that's one of the big weaknesses of a greater good, is how do you calculate what is actually needed to offset the good now at that point, or the evil at that point. Jackson?
So is that not just an appeal to mystery then?
It's not a direct appeal to mystery, because we're not saying we simply don't know. We're saying there is a good. We just may not be able to know what that good is or the value of that good. You're still offering an explanation, so it's not a direct appeal to mystery. Yes, ma'am.
Wouldn't that value be subjective to each person?
Oh, yeah. Like, I think some goods are better than other goods, right? Like, I would like a new car more than, I don't know. What else is something really good? A trip to Disney World. I don't know. Take your pick, right? Yeah, that's right. Isn't it not just subjective? We would say it can't be, because it has to be objective to God. God has to set the values of good and evil at that point. So even though we may see it as subjective, overall it cannot be, because it cannot just be random for each person.
But then there's still suffering.
Yeah, that's right. There is still suffering, right? So that's the problem. There is still suffering that occurs. What do we do about that? And I don't know. I think that's where the greater good runs into a lot of problems, I think. Yes, ma'am? Yeah. Yes, you?
Yeah. Is it also fair to say that a weakness would be that, God could have allowed whatever the greater good is to happen without the evil?
Oh, yeah. Let me give you guys the classic example. I'm going to go back to the example of Sue, the 5-year-old who was raped and killed. Most people say that her greater good is heaven. She dies, she gets to go be with Christ in heaven, and that's the greatest good. But wait a second. Could God have not just allowed her to go to heaven without all that suffering? I think that is well within reason to say that. And I think that is, again, another big issue with the greater good. Questions like that. Because it is, yeah, there may be a greater good, but why, God? Why did you have to make me suffer this much for it? Couldn't the suffering have been just a little bit less? Couldn't it have been a little bit shorter? Couldn't it have been just no suffering at all? Right? Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Can you go back to the actual slide where you're talking about the greater good?
Yep.
And its problems. Yeah, there it is. All right.
I got you.
Cool. So the second bullet point there, the theist must prove this is true in every case. I want to push back against that a little bit.
Yep.
Right. Is that necessarily true? So, because there seems to be a problem with ontology versus epistemology.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, where we're saying it could be the case that there is a greater good even if you don't know what it is, and also it seems to be tying it to a specific person rather than let's say Sue dies, whatever, and it's not about her, but the immense suffering that she goes through causes both of her parents to come to Christ, for instance, right? So it may not be a greater good for that person the suffering occurs to, but it's a greater good at large.
Yeah, so you kind of have two questions here. First one is, what if we just don't see it, right? Do we have to prove it? So this is what we call, that's right. It's a question of what we call ontology versus epistemology, a thing's being and a thing's knowledge, whether we know that it happened and whether it is actually something that has happened. This is where things get tricky. The atheist, especially Roe, he's looking at this and going, I can see clear evidence of evil. That's why it's called the evidential argument. He's looking at the evidence, and he's pushing back at the Christian, and he's saying, you Christian, you claim that God is so good and so powerful. Why can't I see the good? Because I can clearly see the evil. There's evidence here of evil. Where is your evidence of good? That's essentially the argument he's making. So, your point, you're bringing up a whole new response. We're going to talk about this next week, so you're jumping the gun on me. It's called skeptical theism. Essentially, maybe we don't see the good. Maybe we can't. We'll talk about this a lot more next week, because this is becoming the more standard Christian response. It's sort of exactly what you're bringing up. Maybe the good happens way in the future. Maybe the good happens to somebody else. But now we kind of have another question. Is the good for the person who suffers, or is the good for others? I think we run into kind of a problem there of who is the good actually for? Should it be for the Sioux who suffers, or should it be for those who something comes out? Like, for example, like you said, the parents who come to know Christ, right? That's the classic example. Maybe the parents come to know Christ later on. But then to your point again, could we not have just done this without suffering in the first place?
Right.
So would you say that skeptical theism is a subclass of the greater good?
It
I would
is.
say that's a specific case. So
It is. Yeah, it is. And we'll talk about that next, because there are different varying versions of greater good. So greater good is not always this, but it does always say there has to be some good that comes out of that evil.
Right.
that's what I kind of wanted to draw out. So it's not, the second bullet is not necessarily true for greater good theodicy in general.
In some sense. Depends on the version you hold. So some people would say, I'm going to show some cards here, that you do have to show it in every case, but it may be different in every case. So for example, maybe evils happen so that you form your character. It's virtue formation. You become brave, you become patient, courageous, right? But in some sense, there still has to be a greater good. Something still has to come out of that evil in order for it to be a greater good. Because if it doesn't, then you have gratuitous evil, and that counts against God's existence. That's sort of the key point there. There has to be something out of that evil.
Did you take any classes with Greg Welty at Southeastern?
I did. I actually took 2 classes. One was Coherence of Theism. It was the toughest class I've probably ever taken, because he's a monster of philosophical theism. And then I took a class on Miracles and the Resurrection with Dr. Welty. If you ever want to be convinced that miracles are possible and they do happen, I would recommend you take that class, because it changed a lot about my thinking on like miracles and the resurrection at the very least. All right, what else? What else you got? Yeah.
How can we make the argument that natural and physical evils are also evil? Because I know moral evil, that's very easy to see, but when we're trying to argue like natural and physical evil, could an argument be made that like a better word could be applied to that than evil, that it's not really evil, it's just bad?
Yeah, some people would say suffering. So the problem of evil is not just the problem of evil, it's also the problem of suffering. Why do we suffer, right? So sometimes natural and physical evils are sometimes also called natural and physical sufferings as well. We tend to call them evils because it's the opposite of good. In other words, all good things come from God because He is all good. If anything else comes from God that seems to be against that, it must be evil in some way. It doesn't have to be. There is a distinction that we often make. We'll often say something like, all evil is suffering, but not all suffering is evil. So sometimes not all sufferings that we endure are because of specific evils. Sometimes life just sucks.
I think
we're kind of defining evil in terms of God, which I mean that makes sense, but like, is there a way to differentiate suffering from evil without an appeal to God? Like not as an argument for God, but like, is there any way to think of evil?
Yeah, I think one way people have tried to distinguish evil and suffering is maybe by agency. So evils are things done from one agent to another. I stat my pastor, right? So in that sense, natural and physical evils may not technically be evils in that sense. It all comes down to your terminology at that point. So some people do kind of mix terminology.
Does the distinction of what is evil therefore become subjective based on that particular agency or majority of a group of people if there's no higher moral authority?
If there is no higher moral authority, then yes. But because this is a problem for the Christian, we would say no. Because it's a problem for the Christian who claims that we do have an authority for morality. That's God.
So we presuppose that biblical moral.
Yeah, we kind of have to, right? Again, the problem of evil is not a moral argument. It's not about what is actually evil. It's the fact that we seem to see evils and we're comparing that to the goodness of who God is, right? So that's the key. It's not about whether we're nitpicking at what evil is. We're saying, oh, we can clearly see evils and suffering. How do we deal with that and who God is?
So I walked in a little late. So
No, you're good.
Did you mention this at the beginning about where we stand, even if the probabilistic problem of evil succeeds, such that it's more likely that God exists than, or sorry, that God does not exist than that He does exist?
Yeah. So to give you guys a little bit of, I'm going to keep refilling my cards here. The state of the debate right now is essentially a stalemate between the theists and the non-theists, or the atheists, as we would say. Right now, we have a problem. The atheist says, hey, Christian, where is the good? I can't see it. And then the theist, or the Christian, comes back and says, well, yeah, you just can't see them. They're there, but you just can't really see them. So what we have right now is essentially what we call a stalemate, like in chess. Nobody wins at this point. The atheist can't really make his point that there are gratuitous evils, but yet at the same time, the Christian also can't make his point that there are not gratuitous evils. They're sort of like headlocked right now because neither of them can prove their point, and so they're just sort of like talking past each other, trying to show whether or not evils are gratuitous or there's some greater good. So to your point, as it relates to a probability argument, technically, according to the laws of logic and philosophy, as long as one side has the pendulum swinging their way, they have the stronger argument now at that point. It doesn't necessarily mean that the argument wins. It just means they have the stronger argument given their argumentation.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, like, let's assume that their argument does win, right? So the argument shows that it is more probable that God does not exist than that God exists. Now, that's the probabilistic argument from evil, but the logical problem of evil that would prove that God does not exist, that's been done and handled for a good couple centuries. So where that leaves us is you have one argument that says that it's less likely that God exists than not. However, you can't just take that in a vacuum. You also have to then compare that to the background information of all the rest of the theistic arguments.
That's right.
Right? And
That's
so, in my view, that even if, which I don't think this does succeed, but even if this does succeed, it is still outweighed by the other arguments for theism.
That certainly. We would call that a cumulative case apologetics. In other words, you build a case for the Christian faith, not off of one argument, but off of many arguments. So things like cosmological, teleological, moral, ontological, name your pick, all the way down to things like the resurrection, right? And so in my opinion, I don't think the problem of evil is disproving the resurrection. Not at all. What I do think the problem of evil does is it causes doubt. And it does so in a really strong manner. So this is why I think you might have missed it when I talked about it earlier. The problem of evil is not always about whether or not God doesn't exist intellectually, but it eventually turns into an emotional problem for us. How can I believe God exists when I do experience evil in my life? For me, like I talked about with apologetics, this is where all those different arguments came in. So you guys probably have talked about some of those throughout the year. I think all those other arguments for God's existence makes him far more likely to exist than not. And I think the resurrection is the biggest argument that we have in our arsenal. But I don't discount the problem of evil, because the problem of evil affects us really deeply, and it cries out for an answer. And this is usually the thing that like sticks with us. It's like that piece of gum that just doesn't go away, and it just bothers you. So at some point, I still think we need to have an answer, because it is such a sticky subject for us to deal with. All right, what else? What else you got? I'm here for you guys.
Out of those 6 or 7 books, like if you had to tell somebody to start with one, or if you had to pick a favorite, which one would it be?
I'm gonna rain on your parade. Not Tim Keller's book. My pastor really loves Tim Keller. So if I were to pick a book, it would be the far right book, God and Evil. It's edited by Chad Meister and James Dew. I think it's a great introduction piece to the problem of evil. My second favorite would be the book to the second from the left, Michael Peterson's introduction. Out of these 7 books, if I had to pick. Next week, I'll give you more books to choose from. Lots of books. All right, anything else? Fantastic. Well, I'm up here. I want to talk to you guys if I can. Just say hi and maybe answer any more questions you guys have. If not, I would love to see y'all next week as well, as we kind of go really full nerd into all of this. All right, sound good? Fantastic. Thank you guys. Julian?